One of the largest lakes on Earth went completely bankrupt, turned into a toxic desert, and was written off by experts as a total permanent loss. And then, an underdog local government used a basic real estate flipping strategy to bring it back from the dead, hitting their massive 2029 recovery targets 4 years early in 2025. This was not some multi-billion-dollar miracle. It was a calculated, high-stakes arbitrage play using dump trucks, sand, and sweat equity. Here is exactly how they hacked a broken ecosystem, and how the exact same logic applies to fixing a broken bank account, a dead asset, or a rigged system. Think of a river like cash flow. For thousands of years, the Aral Sea had incredible cash flow. It was the 4th largest lake on the planet. It sat right in the heart of Central Asia, right on the border of modern Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. We are talking about 68,000 square kilometers of water. That is roughly the size of the Republic of Ireland. It received about 56 cubic kilometers of fresh water every single year from 2 massive mountain rivers. The Sir Darya flowed in from the northeast. The Amu Darya flowed in from the southeast. Both of these rivers carried pure snowmelt from the Pamir and Tian Shan mountains, some of the tallest peaks in Asia, down across 1,000 kilometers of steppe and desert directly into this massive inland bowl. The asset was performing flawlessly. It was a functioning, highly productive ecosystem. The lake supported booming regional port cities. Towns like Aralsk on the northern shore and Minac on the southern shore were thriving. The local commercial fishing fleets operating out of those 2 harbors were pulling in somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 tons of fish every single year. That catch supported tens of thousands of livelihoods and fed a massive portion of the protein supply for all of Central Asia. Then the Soviet government decided to step in and restructure the portfolio. Starting in the 1950s, the Soviet Union decided they wanted to completely dominate the global cotton market. They wanted to be entirely self-sufficient. Cotton is an incredibly thirsty crop, and the warm, fertile soils of the Central Asian river deltas looked like the perfect place to grow it. So, they looked at the massive cash flow feeding the Aral Sea and decided to divert it. They launched a campaign called White Gold. Over the next 30 years, Soviet engineers built one of the largest agricultural water diversion systems in human history. They built 45 major dams. They built 80 different reservoirs. And they dug over 30,000 kilometers of irrigation canals. All of this was designed to siphon the water out of the Sir Darya and the Amu Darya and redirect it onto the cotton fields. But here is the problem. The engineering was aggressively flawed. They did not use modern pipes. They did not line the canals with concrete. They literally just dug unlined trenches straight through loose desert sand. It was exactly like trying to carry water in a colander. Water poured into one end of the trench, soaked directly into the ground through the sides, and evaporated off the top under the desert sun. By the time the water actually reached the cotton fields at the other end, massive amounts of it were gone. Peer-reviewed estimates show that somewhere between 25% and 75% of the original water simply vanished into the dirt before it ever touched a single plant. Tens of cubic kilometers of fresh water were completely wasted every single year. The Aral Sea's income essentially dropped to zero. By the 1980s, in dry years, the inflow from the rivers completely stopped. The lake was suddenly losing more water to the sun than it was gaining from the rivers. This created what ecologists call a catastrophic feedback loop. As the lake lost water, it got shallower. Shallower water heats up much faster in the sun. Hotter water means faster evaporation. Faster evaporation means the lake gets even shallower. The entire process accelerates on itself. And as the water disappeared, all the salt that had been naturally dissolved in it had nowhere to go. The concentration spiked. By the late 1990s, parts of what was left of the southern basin had reached salinity levels around 100 grams per liter. That is roughly 3 times the saltiness of the open ocean. Almost nothing could survive in water that salty. The native fish suffocated. The massive commercial fishing industry completely collapsed. The fleets of ships were left stranded in the sand miles away from the retreating shoreline. In 1987, the water level dropped so far that the lake physically broke. It split into 2 entirely separate water bodies. There was a small, deep lake in the north inside Kazakhstan, fed by whatever was left of the Syr Darya. And there was a massive, shallow, rapidly dying lake in the south inside Uzbekistan, fed by the completely drained channels of the Amu Darya. Then came the dust. 60,000 square kilometers of former lakebed dried out, baked under the relentless Central Asian sun, and turned into a vast new desert. Scientists officially named it the ARAL. But this was not normal, clean desert sand. This was the bottom of a lake that had been collecting intense agricultural runoff for 30 years. Pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, chemical defoliants from the cotton industry, and heavy metals had all settled at the bottom. When the water vanished, all of that toxic waste baked into a hard crust of salts and contaminants several centimeters thick. When the wind picked up across the ARAL, that toxic crust was launched directly into the atmosphere. Studies show that between 14 and 27 million tons of toxic dust were thrown into the air from the dry seabed every single year. Researchers actually detected ARAL dust landing as far away as the Arctic Circle and the peaks of the Himalayas. The people living in the dying towns around the former sea were breathing this toxic cocktail constantly. Rates of respiratory disease, kidney failure, and infant mortality in the surrounding districts skyrocketed. It became one of the worst public health crises in the entire former Soviet Union. By the late 1980s, the international scientific community had largely written the Aral Sea off entirely. The specific phrase that started appearing in academic papers and World Bank risk assessments was sacrifice zone. They viewed it as a piece of the planet that was simply going to die, a lost cause that no realistic engineering project or amount of money could ever save. The property was officially condemned. But in the spring of 1992, a regional Kazakh mayor named Adar Askarovic Idijanov saw a massive hidden arbitrage opportunity. Idijanov and his local engineering team realized something that almost nobody at the international level had bothered to look at closely. The North Aral and the South Aral were actually two completely different problems. The south was vast, shallow, and depended entirely on a river that was being consumed by Uzbekistan's cotton fields. No Kazakh engineer had any political or practical ability to fix that. The south was going to keep dying. But the north was a completely different story. The north was deeper. It was much smaller. And crucially, it still had a tiny bit of the Syr Darya River flowing into it. The river was beaten down and severely diminished by all the upstream irrigation, but it was still delivering a steady trickle of fresh cash flow. The structural problem was that every single drop of fresh water hitting the northern basin was running straight south through a narrow channel called the Berg Strait. It was spreading out across the vast, shallow southern desert and evaporating into nothing. The north was essentially a bathtub with the drain left wide open. The faucet was still barely on, but all the water was running straight out the bottom. The fix was almost embarrassingly simple. They just needed to plug the drain. Mayor Idijanov did not have billions of dollars in funding. He did not have concrete, steel reinforcement, or approval from international consultants. He had a few hundred local workers and a fleet of dump trucks. So he scooped up ordinary desert sand, drove out to the edge of the Berg Strait, and started dumping it into the open water. His plan was to pile sand across 13 kilometers of open water until he had built a physical wall to plug the hole in the bottom of one of the largest environmental disasters on Earth. And here is the thing. If you have ever been backed into a corner and had to fix a massive, overwhelming problem using absolutely zero budget and just pure hustle, tell me exactly what you did down in the comments. Because that is exactly what this was. Pure survival and sweat equity. Against all odds, the dump truck wall actually worked. For the first few years, the water on the north side of the sand wall stopped leaking. The levels began to rise. The intense salinity began to slowly drop. Fish that had been functionally extinct in those waters for over a decade suddenly started showing up again. People who had abandoned their fishing villages years ago started cautiously coming back to see if the water was real. And then, in the spring of 1999, the entire project literally collapsed overnight. A massive surge of spring snowmelt came roaring down out of the mountains and surged through the Syr Darya. The flood hit the sand wall with terrifying force. Because the wall was built out of nothing but piled dirt, it was simply overtopped and blown apart. 2 workers died trying desperately to reinforce it in the dark. The water they had spent years saving poured violently back into the southern desert and evaporated. Years of intense progress completely vanished in the span of a single night. Most people would look at that tragedy, cut their losses, and walk away forever. But that massive failure is exactly what saved the ecosystem, because the wreckage of that sand wall proved one undeniable fact to the engineers studying it. The crash did not prove the idea was bad. It proved the underlying physics were exactly right. The asset actually wanted to recover. The water had come back. The biology had responded. The ROI was entirely real. They just needed to build infrastructure that would not break under pressure. So the Kazakh government made a massive, highly calculated play. In 2001, they approached the World Bank and secured an $86 million loan. In the grand scheme of global infrastructure and environmental repair, $86 million is absolute pennies. It is the definition of an extreme budget flip. They formally committed to building a permanent version of the mayor's sand wall. They called it the ARAL Dam. It was 13 kilometers long, built out of heavy earthfill, and heavily reinforced with concrete. But the absolute genius of the ARAL Dam was its mechanical release valve. They installed a massive 9-gate spillway. It acted as a built-in risk manager. They knew the spring floods would come back. But now, when the snowmelt surged, they could simply open the mechanical gates and safely release up to 600 cubic meters of water per second into the dead southern basin. The pressure would drop and the dam would hold. Even better, that exact same gate system served a second critical purpose. Every time they opened those gates to release water, it forcefully flushed the accumulated toxic salt out of the northern basin. It kept the chemistry perfectly balanced. They finished pouring the concrete and completed the ARAL Dam in August of 2005. And what happened to the water on the north side of that wall over the next 20 years absolutely shattered every single scientific projection on the books. When the dam was finished, the official hydrologists managing the project made their calculations. They estimated that with the drain finally plugged, the water level in the North ARAL would take somewhere between 3 to 5 years to reach its target elevation of 42 meters above sea level. They were completely wrong. The water in the northern basin rose to the target level in exactly 7 months. The progress was so violent and fast that it stunned the researchers. The shoreline, which had retreated roughly 40 kilometers away from the old port city of Aralsk, started racing back northward so fast you could literally track it on satellite imagery month by month. Nature did not need a 5-year timeline. It just needed the massive leak stopped. And then the compounding interest truly kicked in. Before the dam was built, the salinity of the North ARAL had reached about 30 grams per liter. That is ocean water. The only species that could still survive in those brutal conditions was the Black Sea flounder. It was a saltwater fish that the Soviets had deliberately introduced back in the 1970s just so there would be anything swimming in the dying chemistry. All the native freshwater species like pike perch, bream, carp, and roach had been completely wiped out of the open lake for decades. They were barely clinging to existence in tiny, freshened pockets right at the mouth of the river delta. But as the river continued to pour pure fresh water into the newly contained basin behind the dam, the salinity completely collapsed. By the early 2010s, it dropped from 30 grams per liter down to between 8 and 10 grams per liter. That is essentially exactly what the chemistry was before the massive Soviet diversions ever started. And that specific number is the trigger. At 10 grams per liter, native fish species can spawn again. Their eggs can survive. Their larvae can actually develop. Nobody brought in massive tanker trucks full of hatchery fish. There was no billion-dollar biological intervention or artificial stocking program. The ecosystem just took over. 22 native fish species flooded out of the river delta, where they had been hiding for decades, and violently recolonized the open water. The pike perch, which is the most commercially valuable fish in the region, went from functionally extinct to dominating the commercial catch. Meanwhile, the Black Sea flounder started to die off. It was suddenly a saltwater fish trapped in a freshwater world, getting completely outcompeted by the native species that had evolved for these exact waters over thousands of years. If seeing an underdog completely crush the expert projections makes you smile, hit the like button right now. Because the compounding returns did not stop with the fish. The fish brought the birds. Massive reed beds rapidly sprouted along the brand new shoreline. White pelicans started circling over water that just 10 years earlier had been a cracked, toxic salt flat. According to the absolute latest ecological surveys, over 300 different bird species are now using the restored river delta as critical nesting and migration habitat. On land, the return of the water and the thick vegetation supported the massive return of wild boar, wolves, and the critically endangered saiga antelope, which is one of the rarest large mammals in all of Central Asia. The local climate actually measurably softened. The new reed beds began functioning as a massive living buffer, trapping moisture in the air and actively blocking the toxic dust storms from ripping through the local towns. The economy exploded right alongside the biology. The commercial fishing industry in the northern Kazakh sector went from absolutely zero catch to pulling in 8,000 tons of fish every single year. They built 12 brand new fish processing plants in a region that recently had none. The number of registered, working fishermen went from under 500 to over 3,000. But here is the deeply uncomfortable truth about this massive, record-breaking win. Nothing. That is exactly what happened to the southern half of the Aral Sea. Absolutely nothing. While the north was experiencing this explosive, hypergrowth recovery, the south was left to completely die. By 2014, the entire eastern half of the South Aral evaporated entirely. It is just gone. Today, the Uzbek government has heavy machinery out on the dry lake bed, literally drilling for natural gas in the dust where massive shipping vessels used to sail. The political and economic incentives that drove the original collapse are still largely in place down south. The Amu Darya River is still completely drained dry by the cotton industry before it ever reaches the southern basin. And that is the hardest, most ruthless rule of structural arbitrage. You cannot save everything. If a system is completely broken and the cash flow is permanently gone, dumping your limited resources into it is a fool's game. The Kazakh government and the World Bank only succeeded because they accepted brutal reality. They cut the dead weight. They drew a hard physical line in the sand, isolated the one single piece of the asset that still had actual potential, and redirected 100% of their focus into that specific deep bowl. You cannot save the whole thing, but the part they did save is growing faster than anyone on Earth thought possible. And the data backing this up just hit a massive milestone. In early 2025, the Kazakh Ministry of Water Resources and the World Bank released their peer-reviewed findings. The strict water level and ecosystem targets that scientists had conservatively projected to hit in the year 2029 were officially reached in early 2025. They hit the massive finish line 4 years ahead of schedule. The total volume of water contained in the North Aral has now hit 27 cubic kilometers. That is a massive 42% increase from where it stood the day the Koch-Aral Dam was completed. The active surface area has expanded to cover over 3,000 square kilometers. The recovery is moving so fast that they have already fully committed to Phase 2. Between now and 2029, they are going to raise the concrete dam by another 2 full meters. That will expand the surface area to nearly 4,000 square kilometers, push the water volume to 34 cubic kilometers, and finally push the actual shoreline right back to the original harbor walls of Aralsk for the first time in over 50 years. But forget the water for a second. Look at what is happening to the actual people. In tiny, remote fishing villages like Tastabek sitting on the new northern shore, the number of inhabited houses has completely tripled over the last decade. Young families who had fled to massive cities like Almaty looking for any kind of work after the total collapse in the 1980s are packing up and moving back. They are returning to their grandparents' hometowns. In modern rural economics, that story is almost unheard of. The entire global trend is people leaving the country for the city. This is a total reverse migration. People are actively, willingly choosing to bet their futures and their families on a place that international agencies recently studied as a permanent, irreversible environmental loss. Here is exactly why this story matters for you right now in your own life. We are constantly conditioned to believe that fixing a massive, overwhelmingly broken system requires a massively complicated, incredibly expensive solution. We think that if our financial life is broken, or our business is failing, or we are trapped in a rigged economic cycle. We have to completely reinvent the wheel to escape it. We think we need $1 million and a flawless master plan to turn things around. This story proves that entire mindset is a lie. The ARAL Dam did not bring the fish back. The dam did not plant a single reed. The dam did not build the fish processing plants or force the young families to move back home. The dam did not heal the local climate. The dam did exactly one incredibly simple, highly focused thing. Plugged the drain. It kept the existing resources exactly where they needed to be. It stopped the leak. And the underlying system, which is infinitely more patient, resilient, and capable than we ever give it credit for, simply took over and did all the heavy lifting. Sometimes the most powerful, aggressive move you can make is not building a massive new system from scratch. It is not finding more water to pour into a broken bathtub. It is just finding the exact point where you are losing your leverage, building a strong wall right there, and letting the compounding returns take over. The comeback is entirely real. The math works. You just have to be smart enough to know exactly where to put the wall. There are massive underdog stories exactly like this happening quietly all over the world, completely ignored by the mainstream news cycle. People are beating rigged systems every single day. So if you want to see the actual blueprints of how the little guy is outsmarting the experts and quietly winning, hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.